Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, my name is Cami, and what I like to do here on YouTube is I like to discuss true crime cases that either no other YouTuber has covered or that very few YouTubers have covered. And that is exactly what we are going to be doing today. If this is your first time seeing me, it's going to be very confusing because this is part 3 of my Natalee Holloway case coverage. So I will leave parts 1 and 2 down in the description box below. And let's get right into the video. On June 13th, 2005, the two men that had originally been arrested on suspicion of Natalee's disappearance were released from jail after their alibis were verified, and this made Dave relieved because he knew that these two guys didn't have anything to do with Natalee's disappearance. So he's kind of like, okay, cool, now we can focus on the actual suspects. Joran Vandersloot, Deepak Kalpoe, and Satish Kalpoe. But on June 17th, 2005, another arrest was made, and this time it was a disc jockey who worked on a tour boat called Tattoo, who had been questioned a few days earlier, and his only connection was that he knew one of the Kalpoe brothers from an internet cafe, and there was no indication that Natalee had been on this boat, nor that she had even been with this guy, but the judge still decided to hold him for 8 days. They didn't find out until later that Deepak had actually contacted this guy for an alibi, and this guy confirmed to police that he had seen the 3 guys drop Natalee off at the Holiday Inn, but didn't realize that by the time that he went to police with this alibi, that Joran had changed his story. So this guy kind of screwed himself. He agreed to be this alibi for these guys and lie to the police, and it ended up screwing him. On the same day that this guy was arrested, it was ruled that Joran's father could not visit him in jail, and Dave says he suspects it's because he had information on Natalee's disappearance, and the very next day, Paulus was actually brought in for questioning and was supposedly taken in as a witness. June 21st, 2005. A search and rescue company led by Tim Miller was brought in voluntarily to Aruba to join in the search for Natalee. They brought in people who were considered experts in search and rescue, and they also brought in search and rescue dogs and equipment that could pick up on human remains in the water. They also rented the only helicopter on the island so that way they could search. Now these were skilled people. It wasn't just like self-professed experts. Some of these people were actually on ground zero on September 11th to look for remains. So these are people that are really good at their jobs. Now, shortly after this, Joran's mother, Anita, made a statement that he had been unfairly targeted, and she complained that only Joran had those visitation restrictions. Specifically that she was only allowed to see him for 10 minutes per day, and that she wasn't allowed to talk about the crime. Which, okay, lady, you at least know where your son is. I can't say the same for the Holloways. On June 23rd, 2005, 2 weeks to the day that Joran was arrested, his father was also taken into custody. And it's said that as soon as the police entered to take Paulus in, Anita immediately called the police chief. And Paulus refused to get into the police car and insisted that he drive himself. And guess what? They let him. They let him drive himself instead of being put in the back of a cop car. We're all thinking it. I don't have to say it again. Not only are the police not taking Natalee's disappearance seriously, but they're also doing the bare ass minimum when it comes to suspects. So Paulus was being held on the charges of suspicion of complicity to premeditated murder, complicity to kidnapping, and murder and kidnapping. Paulus had given statements to the press that directly conflicted with what he told the police, and there was also talk on the island that Paulus had picked Joran up early in the morning after Natalee had disappeared, and he knew more than he admitted, which, wow, what a shock. So the search kept going for Natalee, and at one point, the police asked them to send divers into the water that filled this like rock quarry behind the Vandersloot home, because a few years prior, there had been a body that showed up, and they decided that only one reporter would be allowed to be present during this search, but that didn't stop others from showing up anyway. The search dogs did not find anything, and at this point, while there hasn't been any evidence that Natalee is dead, this kind of gave Dave hope. He thought, since no remains have been found, that must mean that she's still alive. 2 days after the arrest, Joran's father was released from custody, as was the disc jockey guy that had been arrested. And again, I do know this man's name because he is named, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to be the reason this guy gets bashed, even if he did help Deepak lie and the fact that he didn't actually have anything to do with the disappearance, in my opinion. So now, the only ones that they have in custody are Yaron, Deepak, and Satish. So according to Prosecutor Jansen, Paulus had obstructed the investigation early on whenever he gave the suspects legal advice before they were arrested. This is referring specifically to him telling them that the day after Natalee disappeared that when there's no body, you don't have a case. And this was confirmed that Paulus said it by the Calpo brothers themselves. The prosecutor also said that Paulus had called one of Yaron's friends to his home to see what else he had told the police when he was being questioned. So now the Calpo brothers were saying that they had dropped Yaron and Natalee off at the beach around 1:30 a.m. and that Yaron had texted them at around 2:40 a.m. to say that he was alone and had left Natalee on the beach and needed a ride home. And supposedly, according to the Calpo brothers, they had told him that they were already in bed and that he should find a new way home. July 4th, 2005 rolls around, and the Calpo brothers were released because the judge ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to hold them for another 60 days. But Yaron had to stay in jail until September 4th. This is because under Dutch law, a suspect can be held for 116 days, possibly as long as 146 days, but the judge has to give permission at intervals in order for prosecutors to keep someone in custody. They have to have a detention hearing after the first 2 days, again at an 8-day period, 3 different times. 2 days, they could have a hearing, then again at 8 days, and then again at 2 days later, again at 8 days later. Does that make sense? Then after that, another hearing is held 60 days after, and then again in the next 30, and then again in another 30 if necessary. And when Yaron was held there, another ruling said that he could have daily visits from anyone, including his father. So because of this rule that anyone could visit him, Dave decides that he's going to go see the prison and see Yaron. But he was informed that he needed to call for an appointment, so he set one up for the next day, for the next Saturday. So he set one up the next day for the next Saturday. But Yaron's lawyer had faxed the family's attorney and said that he and Beth were not allowed to see Yaron. But Dave didn't know that, so he kept the appointment. In this book, Dave goes into a ton of details about his visit to the prison, and I won't go too much into it just because it was basically just a lot of conversation with Yaron's father, since he didn't end up getting to see Yaron. Again, I highly recommend reading Dave's book if you want a full account of what happened at the prison. And again, I'll link it down below. Yaron's father did, however, inform him that the Calpo brothers were not involved and that the interrogators were supposedly torturing Yaron. Yaron's father also used this opportunity to say that they should look at the boys from Natalee's school because they probably had something to do with it. More and more arrests were being made, and leads were coming in, and as this was going on, the family wasn't getting any information about what information that the prosecution had. However, as suspects were released, the one that they did keep in prison was Yaron. In the middle of July, a park ranger ended up finding a piece of duct tape with strands of light and dark blonde hair stuck to it on the beach. Now, Aruba doesn't actually have a lab to test forensic evidence, so they had to carry this piece of duct tape to the Netherlands for testing, and it was also sent to the FBI headquarters for DNA analysis. A few days after that, all 3 of the boys refused to give samples, and so they were brought to the hospital under a court order. But the judge ruled that the boys' DNA was inadmissible, so none of it was analyzed. I mean, in the end, it doesn't matter because it was determined that this hair didn't belong to Natalee, but this country is really doing everything that they can to not hold any of these boys responsible for what they possibly could have done to Natalee. I say possibly done to Natalee because we don't know for sure. This is all alleged. On July 18th, 2005, a team of divers found a barrel in the water near the Marriott, and they struggled for hours to pull this barrel up onto the beach. And the theory was that this barrel contained Natalee's body inside of it, and thankfully it turned out to be concrete in the barrel to hold down a buoy. So this new witness later comes forward saying that he knows where Natalee's body was buried. The search team ended up going to this location with this special equipment that could measure ground density, And basically this would determine if something had been buried there recently, and they also had this machine that detected vapors from a decomposing body. So if you don't know anything about dead bodies, which most people don't, they release this gas, and it's why a lot of times when bodies are dumped into the water or someone just drowns, they end up floating up a few days later. But this search once again showed nothing. Eventually, firefighters began draining this pond across the street from the Marriott where the Calpo brothers claimed that they dropped Yaron and Natalee off. And this happened after a gardener came forward and said on the night that Natalee disappeared, he saw all three boys together near the same place that they claimed they had left Natalee. He said that it was around 2:30 a.m. and that he saw Yaron in the front seat, in the driver's seat, and Deepak in the front passenger seat, and Satish in the back, who ducked down to try and hide from him. Now, this was actually an important tip because this was after the Calpo brothers claimed that they were home, so the area was searched and nothing was found. Now, this tip gives another crucial piece of evidence, and that's the position of the car. If the car was heading away from Carlos and Charlie's, it would have been on a 4-lane highway going past the Holiday Inn on the left. Then it would have passed the Marriott on the left, then the lighthouse, and then it would have passed a dirt road about 100 yards after the Marriott on the right, cutting across the field. And this dirt road is approximately 300 yards long and leads to the back of the Raquette Club. If the car was facing the Raquette Club, then the crime scene was possibly the lighthouse or the beach area of the Marriott on the left side of the road. Yaron had supposedly lost his sneakers on the beach that night that Natalee disappeared, so now they were wondering if he lost them while putting Natalee in the pond. Additionally, if his car wasn't facing the Raquette Club, then the crime scene may have been the club in a vacant house that was under construction around the club, or they were waiting for another meeting with another person who wouldn't see the vehicle if it was parked off the road. Now, witnesses also said that when they left Carlos and Charlie's, Yaron and Natalee were in the back seat while the brothers were in the two front seats. So when and why did they change position? They later found out that the car was facing the Raquette Club next to the pond, and it had come from the highway that ran adjacent to the Marriott. At the end of July, almost 2 months after Natalee had disappeared, the pond and the field were still being drained and searched based on the gardener's statement. One pond was actually drained twice, but the one near where the car was couldn't be drained because it was too close to the ocean. So water just kept leaking in it. I'm sorry. I don't mean to laugh. That mental picture is really funny to me. Like, we got the pond drained, but now we got to deal with the ocean. Additionally, Yaron was being interrogated for up to 10 hours a day, and this interrogation was more like the police berating him and withholding food, which is totally legal in Aruba, by the way. Authorities had flown interrogation behavior specialists in from Holland, and Yaron still was not giving any answers as to what happened to Natalee. Days are passing, and still no word of where Natalee is, and while leads are pouring in, they weren't really actually leading anywhere, and Dave is just getting desperate at this point. He's exhausted. He's had his body all torn up from tearing at rocks on the beach, and he's just looking anywhere and everywhere. He's following any leads, no matter how ridiculous they sound, because he's just desperate at this point to find even her remains. So, officials get word of this, and they're pissed. They tell Dave he needed to back off because he was going in there and shaking things up. Now, 10 days after Natalee disappeared, the same day that Yaron was arrested, Beth had gone on TV to criticize the Aruban government and the police, and honestly, I don't blame her. She said that she had a right to know what the government was doing. We're going to talk about the outcome of that in just a minute. Dave had been contacted by Larry Garrison in the beginning of August, and this man was the president of Silver Creek Entertainment and an executive producer in film and television. He said he wanted to help find Natalee and that he knew how to use the press to his advantage. So this man actually looked through the tips to try and find reliable ones and brought these reliable tips to ABC, NBC, MSNBC, and he gave the following information. Approximately 1 week after Natalee's disappearance, a decapitated man was found in a local Aruban cemetery. This man was supposedly in charge of incinerating bodies at the nearby funeral home. It's rumored that this man was hired by Paulus to incinerate Natalee's body and then killed to keep quiet. An email came in saying that authorities found a key in Deepak's car, but that police had lost it. Supposedly, this key allowed access to an underground kitchen in the basement of the former Wyndham Hotel, and it's rumored that Deepak's mother may have worked there, and that the boys may have used the kitchen as a hiding place, and that the cooler in the kitchen may have contained Natalee's body. However, an investigation by ABC said nothing ever came of it. Now again, in his book, Dave mentions that he had met with someone who claimed to have technology that was incredibly accurate and could find human bodies. And you can find that entire conversation in his book. It's a lot of information, and I don't want to delve too deep into this aspect, because it would make this video so long. So I highly recommend reading it if you want exact details on it. But it never ended with them getting any closer to finding Natalee, and Dave said he thought the whole thing was a hoax. At one point, they were so desperate that they actually ended up contacting a psychic who claimed that she had made contact with Natalee, and that Natalee said that Yaron had choked her to death, and that the boys put her in this solid white fishing container, weighed it down, and brought her out to sea. So the search began to take place since there was a report of a cage missing, so they considered this to be a credible tip. But again, this didn't give any kind of results. So let me go back for a minute and talk about what it was that Beth did that really got the Aruban people to not like her. Beth was doing a ton of interviews at this point. This was about a month after Natalee went missing. And she went on this interview and said that the Calpo brothers were criminals, and the locals did not like that at all. They took down all of Natalee's missing posters from their places of business, and they just really stopped being on Beth's side. They started protesting Beth being on the island and really just wanted her to leave, because they took this as Beth calling Aruba all these things. One day when Beth was going to get a color copy of Natalee's graduation picture to put on like the missing posters, she actually ended up going into the copy place that Deepak worked and just kind of started talking very aggressively about Natalee. And it ended up with her being hit with a letter from Deepak's attorney saying that she had harassed him. Honestly, if it was me, I'd say he was lucky to not get clocked in the face. That's just me. So jump to August 2005. Dave is still in Aruba trying to find Natalee, and Dave is just starting to hear these rumors that Natalee had been seen working at a brothel and that she was being kept as a sex slave. It was all stuff he had heard before, but that he was still hearing now. One of the tips he said really reminded him of Amy Bradley, which is another case I want to cover eventually that's also reminiscent of this one a bit. After a while, a ton of women started to come forward talking about their experiences with Yaron and how they had been drugged and date raped by him just a few weeks before Natalee's disappearance. Eventually, Dave got a lead from one of the tip emails that Natalee was still alive but being held in an apartment in California. But at the same time, he also got a ton of other emails with a bunch of different tips. Some saying they saw Natalee on a boat dancing, some saying she had committed unalive. YouTube doesn't like that word, so. And overall, just a ton of unreliable tips. But he also said he had gotten some emails voicing their hope that Natalee would be found, and Dave said he really liked getting those emails because I assume it reminded him that people still cared about Natalee's case. There were also a ton of conspiracy theories in these emails, as they tend to do, and a lot of emails were in support of Yaron, and those were definitely the worst to read. I read all the emails. He writes all of them in his book. They were the worst to read because a lot of them blamed Beth for Natalee's disappearance, saying Natalee didn't want to go to college and that they would run away if they had Beth for a mother. It was sick. So let's jump ahead to talk about when Yaron is in prison. There was word that he had supposedly broken down in prison and confessed that he buried Natalee's body by the fisherman huts near the Marriott. And the police then brought all three boys to this place to show them exactly where they had buried Natalee, but nothing was found to suggest that Natalee was there. And after that, Yaron went back on his previous story, well, one of them, and said that he had left Natalee alone on the beach, asleep. But now he's saying that he thinks Deepak went back, assaulted her, murdered her before burying her near the fishermen's huts. So now he's pointing fingers, right? Like, later though, he did change his story again and said that both he and Natalee fell asleep and he woke up and left her, but he kept consistent that it was Deepak that killed her. So at this point, no one is taking him seriously because of how many times this guy has changed his story. Now let's talk real quick about what Yaron's full... I can't say that word. Father. I keep wanting to say folder. Now let's talk real quick about what Yaron's father told the police. Supposedly, he picked Yaron up at McDonald's at 4:30 a.m. on May 30th. Then it changed to 11 p.m. on May 29th, which was hours before any witness saw Yaron with the Calpo brothers, where they said they had dropped Natalee off way earlier. There was also evidence showing that Deepak had signed into the internet between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. But it's also possible that someone else could have been using his account, and additionally, their mother also said that they weren't home the night that Natalee disappeared at midnight, and she thought they had returned home around 3 a.m. She says she knows this because she leaves her door open until they get home, and they always close it to let them know that they're home, even if she's asleep. Once she realized this blew a giant hole in their alibi, she tried really hard to get the taped interview back because she didn't want them to get in trouble. There's also an interview with Deepak where he just slut-shames Natalee, and I'm not going to talk about any of it because it's incredibly disrespectful, and I don't want any of this video to talk negative about Natalee. Natalee is the victim here. She was a good kid, and regardless of how someone dresses, it's never an invitation for something to happen to them, especially not what happened to Natalee. And I also want to make it very clear that even if Natalee did sleep with any of these boys, it's not an invitation to assault and murder her. So, are we clear on that? Good. So it's just an all-around really gross interview, and I felt gross reading it. And the tape of Deepak's interview was also widely criticized, and we'll get into why in just a minute. The Dutch legal system is super lax on perps of sexual assault too. In September of 2005, an Amsterdam court sentences 11 boys between the ages of 14 and 17 to up to 12 months in what is essentially juvenile detention for raping 3 girls between ages 13 and 14. The last 3 months of their sentence was suspended, and 10 of the boys were released immediately for time already served. Also, add to that Yaron already had leniency because of who his father was. Yaron knew he could get away with some shit, okay? Another thing I'd like to note is that the chief of police supposedly is Yaron's godfather. So maybe that could be the reason he never took the investigation seriously. So in August of 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit, Dave was sure that because of Katrina that people would have forgotten about Natalee's case, especially with all the coverage of Hurricane Katrina, but it turns out that they hadn't. And I can confirm, like I said, I live in Louisiana. Was born and raised here, and I lived in one of the areas that was affected by Katrina, and that was like the 2 biggest headlines around that time in news was Natalee Holloway and Hurricane Katrina. However, much of the news coverage that Natalee's case was getting had disappeared, and living in Mississippi, Dave was kind of disconnected from the outside world. He was without power, and he didn't get a chance to watch any of the news. And at this point, I think he's still living in Meridian, which is about 3 hours away from where I live, and I can confirm, whenever we did evacuate after Katrina had hit, whenever we were finally able to get out of our house, we stayed in Meridian overnight, and like the only places that really had power in Meridian were the hotels. So once the hurricane had kind of died down, coverage picked right back up on Natalee's case. And on August 26th, the FBI called to let Dave know that the Calpo brothers had been arrested once again, along with one of their friends, for suspicion of another crime unrelated to Natalee. This friend called himself the Loco Man Pimp. He was accused of taking photos of a minor female in tempting poses. He was also suspected of unspecified physical contact with the girl. The Calpo brothers, along with Yaron, were suspects in this incident that happened before Natalee disappeared. Another important thing that I want to bring up really, really quick. Yaron in 2010 was also sentenced to 28 years in prison for the murder of Stephanie Flores Ramirez in Peru. And I don't want to go into details of that since it would be a whole extra video to talk about. I just wanted to bring it up since it shows proof that this man is capable of murder. He was also indicted by a grand jury in the US for wire fraud and extortion in regards to Natalee's disappearance. So Deepak heard that his alibi had been compromised, and he tried to get someone else to lie for him to cover up this hole in his alibi, and that's supposedly why Deepak was arrested a second time. And additionally, Dave heard that the brothers were being held on suspicion of rape and murder in Natalee's case. So they think they are finally getting somewhere with Natalee's case, but in September, they actually got the news that set the case back. On September 2nd, 2005, all 3 suspects were released from prison. Dave said this was a setback, but at this point they were so used to these setbacks that it really didn't surprise them anymore. They had filed a motion to overturn the release, but they lost that on September 14th, 2005. Additionally, it was ruled that all restrictions on the boys were to be lifted, and shortly after they were released, Prosecutor Jansen once again requested a search of the pond near the Marriott that had been previously drained. When it was drained, they found a pocketbook filled with rocks to keep it down, 2 cloth bags, a shoe, a machete, and 2 pieces of drug paraphernalia. They were supposed to see if any of these items had any relation to Natalee, but Dave learned that Natalee only had $50 and her driver's license with her at the bar, so they didn't think any of these items belonged to Natalee. Now, Yaron went on to do this interview where he just kind of said a lot of things that he had already said, and that he and the Calpo brothers had all agreed to lie to law enforcement, which we already knew, but now he's finally admitting it. In October of 2005, a man named Jamie Skeeters made tapes where he questioned Deepak about Natalee, and he asked Deepak about Natalee's disappearance. And Deepak said that neither he nor his brother did it, and that it had to be Yaron that killed Natalee. In 2007, there was supposedly new evidence that led to the rearrest of the 3 men on suspicion of involvement of manslaughter that resulted in the death of Natalee. On January 31st, 2008, Dutch crime reporter Peter R. de Vries claimed that he had solved the Holloway case. De Vries stated that he would tell all on a special television program on Dutch television on February 3rd. And on February 1st, the Dutch media reported that Yaron made a confession regarding Natalee's disappearance. Later that day, Yaron said that he was telling the individual what he wanted to hear, and he denied any involvement in her disappearance. That same day, the Aruba prosecutor's office announced the reopening of the case. So this broadcast aired on February 3rd, 2008, and it included excerpts from footage recorded from hidden cameras and microphones in the vehicle of a man named Patrick van der Eem, a Dutch businessman and ex-convict who gained Yaron's confidence. Yaron was seen smoking marijuana and stating that he was with Natalee when she began convulsively shaking and then became unresponsive. Yaron claimed that he attempted to revive her without any success, and he said that he had called a friend who told Yaron to go home and who disposed of the body. An individual reputed to be this friend, identified in the broadcast as Dowry, has denied Yaron's account, indicating that he was then in Rotterdam in school. The Aruban prosecutor's office attempted to obtain an arrest warrant for Yaron based on these tapes, but a judge denied the request, and the prosecutor's office appealed the denial, but the appeal failed on February 14th. The appeals court held that the statements on those tapes were inconsistent with evidence in the case and were insufficient to hold Yaron. On February 8th, Yaron met with Aruban investigators in the Netherlands and denied that what he said on the tape was true, stating that he was under the influence of marijuana at the time. Imagine saying that you lied because pot made you do it. Yaron indicated that he still maintains that he left Natalee on the beach that night, which that's one of the 20 million stories he's told. In March of 2008, news reports indicated that van der Eem was secretly taped after giving an interview for Aruban television. Van der Eem, who was under the impression that the cameras had been turned off, disclosed that he had been a friend of Yaron for years, which directly contradicted his statement on the show that De Vries guy was on. And in that statement, he claimed that he had met Yaron in 2007. He also said that he had expected to become a millionaire through his involvement in Natalee's case, and that he knew the person who had supposedly disposed of Natalee's body. He also claimed that Yaron had asked him for 2,000 euros to buy his silence. According to Dutch news service ANP, Patrick, who had already signed a book deal, was furious after learning of the taping and threatened the interviewer, who sought legal advice because of it. Van der Eem published a book called Overboard, and it was co-written with a person named E.E. Byers. It was released in Dutch on June 25th, and Van der Eem was arrested on December 13th in the Netherlands for allegedly hitting his girlfriend with a crowbar and engaging in risky behavior while fleeing the police. This guy sounds like a treat. On March 29th, 2010, Yaron contacted John Q. Kelly, who was Beth's legal representative, with an offer to reveal the location of Natalee's body and the circumstances surrounding her death if he were given an advance amount of $25,000 against a total of $250,000. Beth's lawyer contacts the FBI, and they arrange to proceed with the transaction because they really wanted to know where Natalee's body was. And on May 10th, Yaron had a $15,000 wire transferred to his account in the Netherlands, following the receipt of $10,000 in cash that was videotaped by undercover investigators in Aruba. Authorities stated that, of course, the information that Yaron gave was false because the house in which he said that Natalee's body was located had not yet been built at the time of her disappearance. And on June 3rd, Yaron was charged in the U.S. District Court of Northern Alabama with extortion and wire fraud. U.S. Attorney Joyce White Vance obtained an arrest warrant and transmitted it to Interpol. And on June 30th, Yaron was indicted on the charges. At the request of the U.S. Justice Department, authorities conducted a raid on June 4th and confiscated items from 2 homes in the Netherlands, and one of those belonged to a reporter named, oh my god, another name that I can't say, Jap Emez. So this guy had actually previously interviewed Yaron and claimed that he had knowledge of Yaron's criminal activities, and Aruban investigators used this information gathered from the extortion case to launch a new search at a beach, but no new evidence was found. And Dave returned to Aruba on June 14th to pursue possible new clues. So in June 2011, which was 6 years after Natalee's disappearance, Dave Holloway filed a petition with the Alabama courts to have Natalee declared legally dead. And this is called, I think, death in absentia. It basically means that even though there's no discovery of a body, that the person is considered legally dead. The papers were served on his ex-wife, Beth, who announced her intention to oppose the petition. A hearing was held on September 23rd, 2011, at which time the probate judge, Alan King, ruled that Dave Holloway had met the requirements for a legal presumption of death. On July 12th, 2012, a second hearing was held, after which Judge King signed the order declaring Natalee Holloway to be pronounced dead. On November 12th, 2010, tourists found a jawbone on an Aruban beach near the Phoenix Hotel in Bukbali Swamp. Part of the bone was sent to The Hague for testing by the Netherlands Forensic Institute. On November 23rd, 2010, Aruba Solicitor General Taco Stein announced that, based on dental records, the jawbone was not that of Natalee's, and that it was not even possible to determine whether it had come from a man or a woman. In 2016, Dave hired a private investigator named TJ Ward once more to go through all the evidence and information related to the disappearance of Natalee. This led to an informant named Gabriel, who claimed that he had been a roommate of one of Yaron's closest friends, American John Ludwig, in 2005. Gabriel claimed that John was told what became of Natalee. And in an interview with the Oxygen television channel, Gabriel gave a detailed description of what happened the night of Natalee's disappearance. On August 19th, 2017, Oxygen created a new documentary series on Natalee's disappearance. And using Gabriel's information, the investigator had found what appeared to be human bones. On October 3rd, 2017, DNA testing concluded that one piece of the bone was human but did not belong to Natalee. On the show, this John Ludwig guy claimed to have helped Yaron dig up, smash, and cremate Natalee's bones in 2010. And in February of 2018, Beth sued the producers, alleging that this and other claims are fictional and harmfully lurid, and that she was misled into giving a DNA sample for comparison without being made aware of the plans for a show. In March 2018, John Ludwig was stabbed to death by a woman he tried to kidnap. So, I guess that's karma for you. So that's where we're at now. I know this was a long one. Like I said, it was my first multi-parter. This case kept me up at night for a very long while, and I knew from the beginning that this was one of the ones that I wanted to cover. I knew the first cases that I wanted to cover at some point were John Walsh, Natalee Holloway, and the Rampart Street Murder House. Those were the top 3 cases that really pushed me to get a jump start on my YouTube channel, because this is the first case that I remember kind of keeping me up when I was a kid. I was 11 when this case first started, and I remember seeing it all over the place. Like I said, anytime I'd be at the store, I'd see a magazine cover with Natalee on it, and I asked my mom about it. It was the first thing I really asked her about. Now, let's get into my opinions on the case. This is one that I go back and forth a lot on, and sometimes I think he killed her and pushed her body out to sea, maybe even dropped her body in the ocean, and sometimes I think Iran sold Natalee into sex trafficking. You know, sometimes I'm like, oh, she would have showed up by now, she was still alive, but then I remember that the J.C. Duggar case where she was missing for, 18 years, so honestly, I don't know. I think this case was probably like the first big name case that I really remember. I mean, I remember watching like shows on like Oxygen and stuff whenever I was a kid with my aunt. Like, I learned about the Toy Box murder, all that kind of thing, but this was the first one that I saw on magazine covers and news about. And I remember seeing, I think it was Elizabeth Smart, whenever she was found. So I remember seeing all that, but this is the first case that I kind of tried to keep up with when I was 11. The thing that really kept me up about this case at night when I was a kid is, where is she? How can a person just seemingly vanish into thin air without any kind of a trace? That's really what kept me up at night, was wondering how someone can just disappear without any sign of where they went. I think all three of the suspects had something to do with what happened to Natalee. And I think Iran told other people what happened, but I think the only people that really had direct involvement with it were the Calpo brothers and Iran. I also think maybe the dad also could have helped some kind of way, but I think as far as killing her, I think it was just the three men. So that is the story of Natalee Holloway's disappearance, and I want to know what you guys think happened to Natalee. Leave those in the comments below, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!